When millionaire rancher Caleb Hartman finds a woman in a wedding dress standing alone on a dusty prairie road, he makes a choice that will change both their lives forever. Evelyn Moore was abandoned at the altar, but her story runs deeper than a simple case of cold feet. As these two wounded souls find refuge in each other under the vast Montana sky, they'll discover that some secrets from the past refuse to stay buried, and that love sometimes demands the highest price of all. If you love stories of second chances, quiet strength, and the healing power of true love, this is one tale you won't want to miss. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming Western romance stories that will touch your soul and restore your faith in love. You won't be alone again. Millionaire Cowboy rescues, abandoned bride, past demands, price. The morning sun painted the Montana prairie in shades of gold and amber, its rays cutting through the early mist that clung to the rolling grasslands like a whisper from heaven itself. The vast expanse stretched endlessly in every direction, broken only by the occasional outcrop of weathered stone and the distant silhouette of mountains that stood sentinel against the pale sky. Caleb Hartman's pickup truck rumbled along the dirt road that wound through his property like a scar across the landscape. At 47, he was a man carved from the same harsh stone as the land he had claimed as his own. His weathered hands gripped the steering wheel with the same steady confidence that had built his fortune from nothing more than determination and an understanding of what the earth could yield to those willing to pay its price. The Hartman Ranch encompassed over 50,000 acres of prime Montana rangeland, a testament to what one man could accomplish when he set his mind to it and didn't let sentiment cloud his judgment. Caleb had learned that lesson the hard way years ago, when trust had cost him more than money ever could. Now, at an age when most men his size had wives and children to fill their dinner tables, he preferred the company of cattle and horses to that of people who inevitably wanted something from him. His weekly drive to town was a necessity, not a pleasure. Supplies needed restocking, business required his attention, and even a man who valued solitude above all else couldn't escape the occasional demands of civilization entirely. The drive usually passed without incident, mile after mile of familiar territory that he could navigate with his eyes closed. But this morning was different. As the truck crested a small rise in the road, Caleb's foot eased off the accelerator. There, perhaps a quarter-mile ahead, stood a figure that seemed so out of place it might have been a mirage. A woman alone on the empty road wearing what appeared to be a wedding dress. The white fabric caught the morning light like a beacon billowing slightly in the prairie wind. Even from a distance, Caleb could see that the dress was elaborate layers of lace and silk that spoke of money and careful planning. But the woman herself stood perfectly still, as motionless as a statue facing away from him toward the endless horizon. Caleb's first instinct was to drive past. Whatever drama had led to this moment wasn't his business, and he'd learned long ago that getting involved in other people's troubles rarely ended well for anyone concerned. His life was ordered, predictable, and free from the complications that came with emotional entanglements. But something about the scene held him. Maybe it was the absolute stillness of the figure, or the way the morning light made her appear almost ethereal against the harsh landscape. Or maybe it was something deeper, a recognition that called to the part of him he thought was dead and buried. As he drew closer, more details became apparent. The woman was tall and slender, her dark hair elaborately styled but beginning to come undone in the wind. She held something in her hands, a bouquet he realized, though the flowers looked wilted and crushed. Her dress, beautiful as it was, showed signs of wear. Dust clung to the hem, and there were small tears in the delicate fabric. Caleb brought the truck to a stop about 20 feet away and sat for a moment, engine idling, studying the situation. The woman didn't turn at the sound of his approach, didn't acknowledge his presence in any way. She might have been deaf to everything but the wind across the grass. Finally, he switched off the engine and stepped out of the cab. His boots crunched softly on the gravel as he approached, and still she didn't move. "Ma'am." His voice carried easily in the still air, rough from years of shouting orders across vast distances. "You all right?" For a long moment, there was no response. Then slowly the woman turned to face him, and Caleb felt something shift inside his chest like a settling of stones. She was beautiful, but it was a fragile beauty marked by exhaustion and something deeper, a weariness that went beyond physical fatigue. Her eyes were dark brown, almost black in the morning light, and they held a depth of sadness that was almost physical in its weight. Her face was pale beneath expertly applied makeup that had begun to smudge, and her lips painted a soft rose color, were pressed together in a line that spoke of hard-won composure. But it was her posture that struck him most. She stood straight despite everything, shoulders back and chin raised as if pride was all that kept her upright. Here was a woman who had been broken but refused to fall. "I'm fine," she said, and her voice was cultured, educated with just a hint of the South in its cadences. "Thank you for stopping, but I don't need assistance." Caleb studied her for a moment, taking in the tremor in her hands and the way she swayed slightly on her feet. "Ma'am, with all due respect, you don't look fine. You look like you've been walking all night." A bitter smile touched her lips. "Perhaps because I have been." "In a wedding dress," the smile vanished. "That's a rather personal question from a stranger." "Fair enough," Caleb said, removing his hat and running a hand through his graying hair. "Name's Caleb Hartman. This is my land you're standing seen on. Now we're not strangers, and I'll ask again, you all right?" For the first time, uncertainty flickered across her features. She looked around as if just realizing where she was, taking in the vast emptiness of the prairie, the absence of any shelter or landmark save the distant mountains. She began, then stopped, pressing her lips together again. When she spoke, her voice was smaller. "I seem to have gotten turned around. I was looking for the main road." "Main road's about 8 miles that way," Caleb said, pointing northeast. "Nearest town's another 12 beyond that. That's a fair walk in good shoes, in those." He gestured toward her feet where delicate white satin slippers peeked from beneath the dress hem. "That's a death sentence." She followed his gaze to her feet, and for a moment her composure cracked. The bouquet slipped from her fingers, hitting the ground with a soft rustle that seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. "I don't," she whispered, then swayed dangerously. Caleb moved quickly, catching her elbow as her knees buckled. She was lighter than he'd expected, all delicate bones and silk under his weathered hands. "Easy there," he said gently. "When's the last time you ate something? Or had water?" She looked up at him with those dark eyes, and he saw the exact moment she realized how desperate her situation truly was. "I... yesterday morning, I think, before..." She trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish the thought. "Before the wedding that didn't happen," Caleb supplied quietly. She nodded once, a sharp movement that spoke of controlled pain. "All right then." Caleb made his decision with the same decisive clarity he brought to all his business dealings. "You're coming with me, Ben. We'll get some food and you let you rest up and then figure out what's next." "I couldn't impose." "It's not an imposition," he said firmly. "It's practicality. You collapse out here and it'll be days before anyone finds you. I don't need that on my conscience." She hesitated, and he could see the internal struggle playing out across her features. Pride warred with necessity, independence with desperation. "I have nothing to offer in return," she said finally. "No money, no... nothing. Did I ask for anything, so no but? Then let's leave it at that." Caleb bent and retrieved the fallen bouquet, noting how the once beautiful flowers had been reduced to wilted stems and bruised petals. Someone had spent good money on this arrangement, had planned and dreamed and hoped. Now it was just another casualty of whatever had gone wrong. He helped her to the truck, his hands steady and impersonal as he guided her to the passenger seat. She moved carefully, gathering the voluminous skirts of her dress with practiced efficiency. Even in her distress, there was something graceful about her movements, a natural elegance that spoke of good breeding and careful education. As they drove toward the ranch house, Caleb stole glances at his unexpected passenger. She sat with her back straight, hands folded in her lap, staring out at the passing landscape with an intensity that suggested she was seeing something other than prairie grass and cattle. Occasionally, a small tremor would run through her, quickly suppressed but unmistakable. "What's your name?" he asked after a few minutes of silence. She turned to look at him, and for a moment he thought she might not answer. "Evelyn," she said finally. "Evelyn Moore." "Well, Miss Moore, Mrs." She corrected automatically, then caught herself. I don't know what I mean anymore." Caleb filed that information away without comment. A woman in a wedding dress who didn't know her own marital status was carrying more baggage than could be unpacked in a single truck ride. The ranch house came into view as they rounded a bend in the road, and Caleb found himself seeing it through a stranger's eyes. The structure was imposing 2 stories of native stone and timber that had been built to last through whatever nature might throw at it. Wide porches wrapped around the front and sides, their roofs supported by thick columns that gave the whole building a sense of permanence and strength. It was a house built for a family, though it had never held one. Caleb had designed and constructed it during the early years of his success, when he'd still believed that money and land were just the foundation for something larger. Now it stood as a monument to plans that had never come to fruition, its empty rooms echoing with the ghosts of conversations that would never happen. "It's beautiful," Evelyn said softly, the first words she'd spoken without prompting since giving her name. "It's home," Caleb replied, though even as he said it, he wondered if that was really true. A house wasn't a home just because you slept in it. He parked near the front steps and came around to help her out of the truck. She was steadier now, but he could see the effort it cost her to maintain her composure. Whatever had happened to her, she was running on reserves that were nearly depleted. Inside the house was as impressive as its exterior suggested. High ceilings, hardwood floors, and windows that offered panoramic views of the surrounding rangeland created an atmosphere of spacious comfort. But there was something missing, the personal touches that made a house feel lived in. The furniture was expensive but impersonal. The walls largely bare, save for a few landscape paintings that could have been pulled from any hotel lobby. Evelyn noticed it too, her intelligent eyes taking in the careful emptiness of the space. If she found it strange that a man of obvious wealth lived like a guest in his own home, she was too polite to comment. "Kitchen's this way," Caleb said, leading her down a hallway lined with doors that stayed closed more often than not. "I'll put some coffee on, see what I can rustle up for breakfast." The kitchen was the most lived-in room in the house, and the only one that truly reflected its owner's personality. It was functional rather than decorative, equipped with professional-grade appliances that spoke of a man who took his independence seriously. The large windows above the sink offered a view of the barn and corrals where his horses spent their days. Caleb gestured to a chair at the solid oak table that dominated the center of the room. "Sit, please." Evelyn lowered herself carefully into the chair, and for the first time since he'd found her, she allowed her shoulders to sag slightly. The wedding dress, beautiful as it was, seemed to dwarf her now that she was seated. She looked like a child playing dress-up in her mother's clothes. As Caleb moved around the kitchen with efficient purpose, starting coffee and assembling ingredients for a simple breakfast, he was acutely aware of her presence. It had been a long time since another person had sat at his table, and longer still since that person had been a woman. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it was charged with unspoken questions and careful politeness. "You don't have to do this," Evelyn said quietly, as he set a plate of scrambled eggs and toast before her. "I know you said it wasn't an imposition, but you're not used to accepting help." Caleb finished taking the seat across from her with his own plate and a cup of black coffee. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "Neither am I," he admitted, "giving it or taking it. But sometimes circumstances don't give us much choice." She took a small bite of eggs, then another larger one, as her body reminded her how long it had been since she'd eaten. Color began to return to her cheeks, and some of the tremor left her hands. "This is very good," she said after a few minutes. "Thank you. You're welcome." They ate in companionable silence, the only sounds the clink of silverware on plates and the distant lowing of cattle from the fields beyond. Through the window, Caleb could see some of his ranch hands beginning their morning routines, and he made a mental note to check on the progress of the fence repairs in the south pasture later. But for now, his attention was focused on the woman sitting across from him, trying to piece together the story that had led to her standing alone on a prairie road in a wedding dress. He'd lived long enough to know that people's secrets were usually more complicated than they appeared on the surface, and something about Evelyn Moore suggested layers of complication that went deeper than a simple case of wedding day jitters. "The coffee is excellent too," she said, wrapping her hands around the mug as if drawing comfort from its warmth. "Secret's in the grinding," Caleb replied. "Most people don't take the time to do it right." "You seem to take time with most things," she observed, gesturing around the well-organized kitchen. "This is the home of a man who pays attention to details. Details keep you alive in this business. Miss a detail, lose a herd. Miss enough details, lose everything." She studied him over the rim of her coffee cup, and he had the uncomfortable feeling that she was seeing more than he usually allowed people to see. There was an intelligence in her eyes that went beyond book learning, an intuitive understanding that made him want to either tell her everything or retreat behind his usual walls of polite distance. What business is that exactly? She asked. Cattle mostly, some horses, land development when the opportunity's right. He kept his answer deliberately vague, though he suspected she'd already figured out that his wealth extended beyond simple ranching. And you do all this alone. The question was casual, but there was something underneath it, not romantic interest, but genuine curiosity about how a person chose to structure their life. I have employees, Caleb said, good men who know their arms, but the decisions, yes, those I make alone. That must be, she paused, searching for the right word. Lonely. Peaceful, he corrected, though even as he said it, he wondered if that was still true. Sitting across from her, sharing a simple breakfast, he was reminded of how quiet his house usually was, how many meals he'd eaten in solitude at this same table. Evelyn set down her coffee cup and smoothed her hands over the wrinkled silk of her skirt. I should explain, she said quietly, about why you found me the way you did. You don't owe me any explanations. Perhaps not, but I owe you honesty at least. She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. I was supposed to be married yesterday to Nathan Cole of the Cole family. Perhaps you know them. Caleb's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. The Cole name carried weight in this part of Montana, old money political connections, and a reputation for getting what they wanted, regardless of who got hurt in the process. He'd had his own dealings with the Cole family over the years, none of them particularly pleasant. I know of them, he said carefully. Then you know they're not the sort of people one simply walks away from. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her coffee. The wedding was, well, it wasn't exactly a love match, more of a business arrangement that would benefit both families. And Nathan got cold feet. A bitter laugh escaped her. Nathan got word that marrying me might not be as advantageous as his mother had led him to believe. Apparently there were certain complications that came to light at the last moment. What kind of complications? Evelyn was quiet for so long that Caleb thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, the kind that make a man realize he's been lied to about what he's really marrying into. Nathan was told he was getting a bride with connections and a substantial dowry. What he got instead was a woman whose family is on the verge of losing everything they own. The pieces began to fall into place for Caleb. An arranged marriage, financial difficulties, a groom who discovered the truth too late and decided to cut his losses rather than honor his commitments. It was an old story played out countless times in families where money mattered more than people. So he left you at the altar. He sent a note, she said quietly. Had one of his groomsmen deliver it just as I was about to walk down the aisle. Very efficient, very cowardly. Caleb felt a flash of anger on her behalf, though he kept it from his voice. And you've been walking ever since. I couldn't face the guests. Couldn't face the explanations, the pity, the whispers. She gestured helplessly. I just started walking. Thought I could get to the main road, find a way back to town, figure out what to do next. But everything looks the same out here and I got turned around. What about your family? They must be worried. A shadow crossed her face. My family has their own problems to deal with. I'm afraid I've become just another one of them. There was pain in her voice, carefully controlled but unmistakable. Caleb found himself wanting to know more to understand what had driven her to agree to a loveless marriage in the first place. But he'd learned that pushing too hard too fast usually made people retreat further into themselves. Instead, he stood and began clearing the dishes from the table. Well, you're safe here for now. Why don't you get some rest? We can figure out the next steps later. I can't stay, Evelyn said quickly. It wouldn't be proper and I don't want to cause you any trouble. If you could just point me toward town. Town's 20 miles away and you're exhausted. You try to walk that distance in your current condition and you'll end up as buzzard food. Besides, he added with a slight smile, I don't think propriety is your biggest concern right now. She wanted to argue. He could see it in her eyes, but practicality won out over pride, and she nodded reluctantly. Just for a few hours, she said, until I can make other arrangements. Just for a few hours, Caleb agreed, though something in his tone suggested he didn't believe it would be that simple. He led her upstairs to the guest room, a comfortable space with windows that overlooked the eastern pastures. The bed was made up with crisp white linens, and there were fresh towels laid out on the dresser. It was a room that rarely saw use, but Caleb kept it ready, nonetheless, a habit left over from a time when he'd believed he might someday have regular guests. "There's a bathroom to right through that door," he said, gesturing toward a doorway on the far wall. "Clean towels, soap, whatever you need. Try to get some sleep." Evelyn stood in the middle of the room looking small and lost despite the elegant wedding dress. "Mr. Hartman, Caleb, I don't know how to thank you." "No need," he said gruffly, already backing toward the door. "Just rest." He closed the door behind him and stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to the soft sounds of movement from within the room. Then he forced himself to walk away, to return to the familiar routines that had structured his life for so many years. But as he went about his morning chores, checking on the horses, reviewing the books, planning the day's work, his mind kept returning to the woman upstairs. There was something about Evelyn Moore that had gotten under his skin in a way that both intrigued and unsettled him. Maybe it was the dignity with which she'd faced her humiliation, or the strength she'd shown in choosing to walk away rather than accept charity she couldn't return. Or maybe it was something simpler and more dangerous. Maybe it was the way she'd looked at him across the breakfast table, as if she could see past the wings he had built around himself to the man he used to be before life had taught him that caring too much was a luxury he couldn't afford. Either way, Caleb Hartman had the distinct feeling that his well-ordered world was about to become significantly more complicated. And for the first time in years, he wasn't entirely sure that was a bad thing. Upstairs, Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed, still wearing her wedding dress, staring out at the endless Montana landscape. Somewhere out there was the life she'd been supposed to live, the marriage, the social expectations, the careful dance of appearances and obligations that had defined her existence for as long as she could remember. But here in this quiet room in a stranger's house, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months' peace. It was temporary, she knew. Reality would intrude soon enough, demanding decisions and consequences for the choice she'd made to walk away from everything she'd known. For now, though, she was safe. And for a woman who'd spent her entire life being other people's solution to their problems, that was a gift more precious than any wedding ring. Evelyn woke to the sound of horses neighing in the distance and sunlight streaming through unfamiliar windows. For a moment, she lay still, trying to orient herself in the comfortable bed with its clean white sheets and the faint scent of lavender that spoke of careful housekeeping. Then memory crashed back like a wave, the abandoned wedding, the long walk across the prairie, and the quiet rancher who'd offered shelter when she'd had nowhere else to turn. She'd slept in the wedding dress, too exhausted to do anything but collapse onto the bed fully clothed. Now, 12 hours later, the elegant silk was hopelessly wrinkled, and she felt grimy and disheveled. Through the window, she could see that the sun was already high in the sky, suggesting it was well past noon. Rising carefully, she made her way to the mirror above the dresser and winced at her reflection. Her carefully styled hair had come completely undone, falling in tangled waves around her shoulders. The makeup that had taken an hour to apply was smudged and streaked, making her look like she'd been crying for hours, which she supposed she had been in one way or another. A soft knock at the door interrupted her self-assessment. "Miss Moore," Caleb's voice was muffled by the wood but clearly audible. "I've left some clothes outside your door. Thought you might want to get out of that dress." She opened the door to find a neat stack of clothing on the floor, jeans that looked like they might actually fit a simple cotton shirt, and what appeared to be women's undergarments still in their packaging. The thoughtfulness of the gesture, combined with the fact that he'd somehow managed to guess her size, brought unexpected tears to her eyes. "Thank you," she called through the door, though she wasn't sure if he was still there to hear it. The bathroom was as well appointed as the rest of the house, with a deep soaking tub and a separate shower stall that looked like it had been designed for someone much larger than her. She filled the tub with hot water and sank into it gratefully, letting the heat soak into muscles that ached from her long walk and the stress of the past few days. As she lay there surrounded by steam and silence, Evelyn allowed herself to think about what came next. Her purse with her money and identification was back at the church, assuming someone had bothered to collect it after her dramatic exit. Her family's house would be full of questions she wasn't ready to answer, and returning to Nathan's world was impossible now that she knew how little her humiliation had meant to him. She realized, truly free for the first time in her adult life. It was a terrifying thought when she finally emerged from the bathroom dressed in clothes that fit surprisingly well. She felt more like herself than she had in days. The jeans were well made but clearly designed for work rather than fashion, and the shirt was a soft blue cotton that felt like a luxury after the constricting bodice of the wedding dress. She'd left her hair loose around her shoulders, unable to recreate the elaborate style without the proper tools, and unwilling to attempt anything too complicated. Downstairs, the house was quiet except for the distant sounds of ranch activity filtering through the windows. She found her way back to the kitchen, drawn by the smell of coffee and something cooking on the stove. Caleb was standing at the counter, his back to her, stirring something in a large pot. He'd changed clothes since morning, trading his good shirt for well-worn jeans and a work shirt that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders. Feeling better, he asked without turning around, somehow sensing her presence. Much thank you. The clothes fit perfectly. How did you... Lucky guess. He turned to face her and she saw something flicker in his eyes as he took in her transformed appearance. Soup's almost ready. Figured you could use something more substantial than breakfast. You didn't have to cook for me. Didn't do it just for you, he said with a slight smile. Man's got to eat too. She took the same seat she'd occupied at breakfast, watching as he ladled thick beef stew into bowls and set fresh bread on the table. Everything about his movements spoke of competence and self-sufficiency. This was a man who'd learned to take care of himself and didn't require help with the basic necessities of life. This is delicious, she said after tasting the stew. Did you learn to cook out of necessity or interest? Necessity? Hard to keep household help way out here, and I got tired of eating beans out of a can. He paused, then added, My mother taught me the basics before she died. Said no man should be helpless in his own kitchen. There was something wistful in his voice when he mentioned his mother, a softness that hadn't been there before. It made her curious about his past, about the experiences that had shaped him into the solitary man he'd become. She sounds like she was a wise woman. She was, tough as nails when she needed to be, but fair. Would have liked you, I think. The casual observation hung in the air between them, more intimate than he'd probably intended. Evelyn felt a flush of warmth that had nothing to do with the hot soup and everything to do with the growing awareness that her initial impression of Caleb Hartman had been incomplete. He wasn't just a wealthy rancher who'd helped her out of charity or obligation. There were depths to him that she was only beginning to glimpse, layers of experience and emotion carefully hidden behind a facade of practical competence. The way he moved through his house, the care he'd taken with her clothes, the simple excellence of the meal he'd prepared. All of it spoke of a man who paid attention to details not just in business, but in the art of living itself. Tell me about the ranch, she said, partly out of genuine interest and partly to steer the conversation away from the dangerous territory of personal observations. How long have you owned it? Built it from nothing about 15 years ago, Caleb replied, settling back in his chair with his coffee. Started with a small parcel and kept adding to it as opportunities came up. Now it's one of the largest spreads in the county. That must have been an incredible dedication. Dedication and luck mostly, though I suppose you make your own luck to some extent. He studied her across the table. What about you? What did you do before yesterday? It was her turn to be evasive, and she could see that he noticed her hesitation. I managed my family's household, made sure everything ran smoothly, handled the social obligations, that sort of thing. Sounds like a full-time job. It was. She set down her spoon, appetite suddenly gone. My mother died when I was 22. After that, I became responsible for maintaining the family's position in society, making sure the right connections were maintained, the proper appearances kept up. And your father and him, my father was a good man who made some bad business decisions. He trusts easily and assumes others share his principles. It's not always a profitable way to do business. Caleb nodded, understanding more than she'd actually said. So you became the family's ambassador, the one who smoothed over the rough spots. Something like that, she managed a bitter smile. I was very good at it too, until I agreed to marry a man I didn't love to solve problems that weren't really mine to solve. The admission hung between them, heavy with implications. Caleb could see the pain in her eyes, the weight of responsibility that had been placed on shoulders too young to bear it properly. It was a familiar story in his world, families that lived beyond their means, children who paid the price for their parents' mistakes. The marriage, he said carefully, it would have helped your family. Supposedly, Nathan's family has money and influence. The idea was that marrying into the Cole family would provide enough stability to save my father's business and secure my younger sister's future. She laughed without humor. What none of us realized was that the Coles had done their own research and discovered exactly how dire our situation really was. But they went through with the engagement anyway. Nathan's mother thought she could use our desperation to her advantage. A beautiful wife from a good family acquired at a bargain price. What she didn't count on was Nathan's lack of spine when it came to actually going through with it. Caleb felt a familiar anger building in his chest, the same cold fury that had driven him to make some of his most successful business deals and some of his worst personal mistakes. The Cole family's machinations were exactly the kind of calculated cruelty that he'd learned to expect from people with too much money and too little conscience. "You're better off without him," he said quietly. "Perhaps, but that doesn't solve the original problem, does it? My family's situation hasn't changed just because I couldn't go through with a marriage that might have saved them. And you feel responsible for that." It wasn't a question, and she didn't treat it like one. "I am more responsible for it. I made the choice to walk away knowing what it would change. What it would cost them." But Caleb corrected. "But what did staying cost on?" She looked at him sharply, surprised by the question. Most people she'd found assumed that duty and sacrifice were inherently noble, regardless of the personal price. They praised women who gave up their own happiness for the greater good, without ever asking whether the greater good might be achieved in some other way. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I'd never really thought about it in those terms. Maybe it's time to start." Before she could respond to that dangerous suggestion, they were interrupted by the sound of boots on the front porch. Caleb's expression immediately became guarded, and he rose from his chair with the fluid movement of a man prepared for trouble. "Stay here," he said quietly, moving toward the window that offered a view of the front yard. Through the glass, Evelyn could see two men standing near an expensive-looking black sedan that had clearly been driven hard over the dirt roads. Both were dressed in suits that probably cost more than most people's monthly salaries, and their posture radiated the kind of casual arrogance that came with money and power. "Friends of yours?" she asked, though something in Caleb's expression told her she already knew the answer. "Cole family men," he said grimly. "Looks like your disappearing act didn't go unnoticed." A sharp knock echoed through the house, followed by a voice that carried easily through the heavy front door. "Mr. Hartman, we'd like a word if you don't mind." Caleb looked at Evelyn, and she could see him weighing his options. The smart play would be to tell them she was here to let them take her back to whatever consequences awaited her in town. It would be the safe choice, the one that didn't involve him and other people's problems. Instead, he said, "Upstairs, the guest room. Lock the door and don't come out until I tell you it's safe." She wanted to argue to tell him that she wouldn't let him fight her battles for her, but the expression on his face brooked no argument, and the sound of increasingly impatient knocking suggested that time was running short. She slipped quietly up the stairs just as Caleb opened the front door. "Gentlemen," she heard him say in a voice that could have cut glass, "what brings you out to my ranch on such a fine afternoon?" "Mr. Hartman." The voice was cultured, but cold like Nathan's, but with more steel beneath it. "We're looking for someone who may have wandered onto your property. A young woman about 5'6", dark hair, would have been wearing a wedding dress." "That's an interesting description," Caleb replied. "Mind telling me why you're looking for this particular young woman?" "She's family," the voice said. "We're concerned about her welfare." From her position at the top of the stairs, Evelyn could hear the lie in the words. These men weren't concerned about her welfare. They were concerned about the complications her disappearance might cause for the Cole family's reputation. "Well, I haven't seen anyone matching that description," Caleb said smoothly, "but I'll keep an eye out. Now, if you gentlemen will excuse me, I have work to do. Perhaps we could take a look around your property." The second man spoke for the first time, his voice carrying an implicit threat. "Just to ease our minds, you understand." There was a long pause before Caleb responded, and when he did, his voice carried a dangerous edge that made Evelyn shiver despite the warmth of the afternoon. "No, Mom," he said simply. "You couldn't. This is private property, gentlemen, and you're not welcome here. I suggest you continue your search elsewhere." "Mr. Hartman," the first man tried again. "I don't think you understand the situation." "I understand it perfectly," Caleb interrupted. You've lost something that belongs to you and you're scrambling to find it before word gets out. But you won't find it here, and if you're smart, you'll stop looking it all together. Some things are better left lost. The silence that followed was thick with tension. Evelyn pressed herself against the wall, hardly daring to breathe, as she waited to see how the confrontation would resolve. Finally, one of the men spoke again. "This isn't over, Hartman." "Yes," Caleb said quietly, "it is." She heard the front door close, followed by the sound of car doors slamming and an engine starting. Only when the sound of the sedan had faded into the distance did Caleb call up the stairs. "They're gone!" Evelyn made her way back downstairs on unsteady legs, her heart still racing from what she'd overheard. Caleb was standing in the living room looking out the front window to ensure that the visitors had truly departed. "They'll be back," she said quietly. "Maybe, but not today." He turned to face her and she could see the tension in his shoulders, the careful control that was costing him an effort to maintain. "The question is, what do you want to do about it?" "I should leave," she said immediately. "I should never have involved you in this. If they know I was here—" "They don't know anything," Caleb said firmly. "They're fishing, hoping to scare someone into giving them information. It's an old tactic. But if they find out you lied to them, let me worry about the Cole family." There was steel in his voice now, the same tone she'd heard him use with the men at the door. "The question is what you want to do. You can go back to town, face whatever music is waiting for you there. Or you can stay here, at least for now, and figure out what comes next." The choice he was offering her was more than just shelter. It was the chance to take control of her own life, to make decisions based on what she wanted rather than what was expected of her. It was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you risk trouble with the Cole family for someone you barely know?" Caleb was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the endless prairie that stretched beyond his land. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of old pain and carefully guarded regret. "Because 15 years ago, I made a deal with people like the Coles," he said quietly. "A business arrangement that benefited me greatly and destroyed someone else's family in the process. I told myself it was just business, that everyone involved was adults who understood the risks." He turned to look at her directly, and she could see the ghosts of old guilt in his eyes. "I was wrong, and I've been living with the consequences of that choice ever since." "What happened?" "A family lost everything they'd worked for because I was more concerned with profit than people. A young woman not much different from you ended up paying the price for her father's mistakes and my ambition." His voice grew quiet. "She died 2 years later. Pneumonia officially, but really she died of a broken heart and a will to live that had been systematically destroyed." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither of them was sure they were ready to cross. Evelyn could see the pain in his eyes, the weight of regret that had shaped the man he'd become. It explained so much about him: the isolation, the careful distance he maintained from others, the way he'd structured his life to avoid emotional entanglements that might lead to similar consequences. "That's why you live alone," she said softly. "Why you've never married." "I learned that caring too much about people can destroy them," he replied. "It seemed safer for everyone if I kept to myself." "But you saved me." "Maybe, or maybe I just gave you a different set of problems to deal with." She moved closer to him, close enough to see the silver threading through his dark hair and the lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into sun and wind. He was a man who'd been alone for so long that he'd forgotten how to accept comfort, but she could see the loneliness beneath his careful control. "What was her name?" she asked gently. "Sarah." The name came out like a prayer or a confession. "Sarah Mitchell. She was 24 when she died." "I'm not Sarah," Evelyn said firmly, "and this isn't 15 years ago. What happened then doesn't have to happen now." "Doesn't it?" He looked at her with eyes that held too much knowledge of how good intentions could lead to terrible outcomes. "You're running from people who have more money and power than conscience. Staying here puts you at risk, and it puts me at risk too. History has a way of repeating itself. Only if we let it." She reached out tentatively, placing her hand on his arm. The contact was electric, sending warmth through her fingers and up her arm. "I'm not asking you to save me, Caleb. I'm asking you to let me save myself." He looked down at her hand on his arm, and for a moment she thought he might pull away. Instead, he covered her fingers with his own, the touch warm and surprisingly gentle for such work-roughened hands. "It's not that simple," he said quietly. "Maybe not, but it doesn't have to be as complicated as you're making it either." She looked up at him, seeing past the walls he'd built around himself, to the man beneath. "I've spent my entire adult life trying to be what other people needed me to be. For once, I'd like to try being what I need to be." "And what's that?" "I don't know yet," she admitted with a small smile. "But I'd like the chance to find out." For a long moment, they stood there in the afternoon light, streaming through the windows, connected by touch and by the growing understanding that they were both carrying wounds that might be healed by time and trust. Outside, the ranch continued its daily rhythms. Cattle grazing in distant pastures, horses moving through their paddocks, the eternal cycle of work and weather that had shaped this land for generations. Finally, Caleb squeezed her hand gently and stepped back, breaking the physical connection, but not the emotional one that had formed between them. "All right," he said quietly, "you can stay, but we do this my way. You follow my rules, and if I say it's time for you to go, you go. No arguments." Agreed. She felt a rush of relief and something deeper gratitude, not just for his protection, but for his willingness to trust her with the truth about his past. "What happens now?" "Now we figure out what your presence here is going to cost and whether we're prepared to pay it." He moved toward the window again, scanning the horizon for any sign of unwanted visitors. "The Cole family doesn't give up easily when they want something. They'll be back, and next time, they might not be so polite about it." "Let them come," Evelyn said with a determination that surprised them both. "I'm tired of running from people who think they own me." Caleb turned to look at her, seeing something in her stance and expression that reminded him of his mother, the same steel wrapped in silk, the same quiet strength that could bend without breaking. Maybe Evelyn Moore wasn't as fragile as he'd initially thought. Maybe she was exactly what she claimed to be, a woman ready to take control of her own life, regardless of the cost. "All right then," he said with the first genuine smile she'd seen from him. "Let's see what you're made of." Outside, the Montana sky stretched endlessly above the prairie, vast and unforgiving and beautiful beyond words. Somewhere out there were people who thought they could dictate the terms of Evelyn's life, who believed that money and influence gave them the right to treat other human beings as possessions to be traded and discarded. They were about to learn that some things couldn't be bought and some people refused to be owned. The only question was whether two wounded souls could find healing in each other's company, or whether the past would once again claim its price in heartbreak and loss. The answer would come soon enough. For now, it was enough that they were no longer facing their demons alone. The days that followed settled into an unexpected rhythm. Evelyn found herself rising early, drawn by the sounds of ranch life beginning before dawn, the low murmur of cattle, the nickering of horses, and Caleb's quiet voice giving instructions to his men. She would make coffee and watch through the kitchen window as he moved through his morning routines with the easy competence of a man who had built his world exactly as he wanted it. He'd offered her work, not charity. Simple tasks, at first helping with the bookkeeping, organizing supply orders, preparing meals for the crew during busy days. Nothing that required specialized knowledge, but everything done with the understanding that her contribution had value beyond mere busy work. "You don't have to treat me like hired help," she'd protested after the first week when he'd insisted on paying her for the hours she'd worked. "I'm not," he'd replied simply. "I'm treating you like someone who earns her keep." There's a difference. The distinction mattered more than she'd expected. For the first time in her adult life, she was working for wages she'd earned through her own efforts, building something that belonged to her, rather than maintaining something that belonged to someone else. It was a small freedom, but it felt immense. The Cole family had not returned, but their presence lingered like a storm on the horizon. Caleb had made discreet inquiries through contacts in town, learning that Nathan's wedding had been officially postponed indefinitely due to unforeseen circumstances. The bride's disappearance was being attributed to pre-wedding nerves and a need for privacy during a difficult time. "They're saving face," Caleb had explained over dinner one evening, "telling everyone you had a breakdown and are recovering somewhere private. It gives them time to figure out their next move without admitting they lost control of the situation." "And what do you think their next move will be?" "Depends on how desperate they are to maintain the fiction that everything is fine." He'd looked at her across the table, his expression serious. "The longer you stay missing, the harder it becomes for them to explain." Eventually, they'll have to either write you off completely or escalate their efforts to bring you back. The conversation had taken place 3 days ago, and since then a subtle tension had crept into their interactions. Both of them were aware that their current situation couldn't continue indefinitely, that decisions would have to be made about the future. But neither seemed willing to be the first to address the growing emotional complexity that underlied their practical arrangements. Because something was growing between them, something deeper than gratitude or convenience. It showed itself in small moments, the way Caleb's eyes followed her movements when he thought she wasn't looking, the way her heart quickened when their hands accidentally touched while working together, the way they'd begun lingering over dinner conversations that stretched well into the evening. They were two people discovering that loneliness was a choice rather than a necessity, that the walls they'd built around themselves might not be as permanent as they'd believed. But they were also two people with complicated pasts and uncertain futures, trying to navigate feelings that neither of them had expected or perhaps wanted. On a Tuesday morning in late September, everything changed. Evelyn was in the kitchen preparing lunch when she heard vehicles approaching the house. Not the familiar sound of ranch trucks, but the smooth purr of expensive engines. Through the window, she could see a convoy of black cars making their way up the drive, moving with the purposeful precision of a military operation. She counted 4 vehicles, more than twice as many as had come before. This wasn't another fishing expedition or casual inquiry. This was a show of force. Caleb, she called, but he was already striding toward the house from the barn, his expression grim as he took in the approaching convoy. Behind him, she could see several of his ranch hands moving with practiced efficiency, not running, but definitely positioning themselves within sight of the house. "Upstairs," Caleb said as he entered the kitchen, his voice carrying the kind of authority that brooked no argument. Same as before. "No." The word came out with a firmness that surprised them both. "I'm not hiding anymore. Evelyn, they're here because of me, and if anyone's going to face them, it should be me." She moved to stand beside him at the window, watching as the cars came to a stop and men in expensive suits began emerging. "Besides, running away is what got me into this mess in the first place." Caleb studied her face, seeing the determination in her eyes and the set of her jaw. This wasn't the same woman he'd found in a wedding dress 3 weeks ago. That woman had been broken by circumstances beyond her control. This woman had found her footing and was ready to stand her ground. "All right," he said quietly, "but we do this together, and if things go badly, you follow my lead." The knock when it came was sharp and peremptory, the sound of people accustomed to having doors open for them without delay. Caleb took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and opened the door to reveal not just the Cole family representatives from before, but an older woman whose bearing and expensive clothes marked her immediately as someone of importance. "Mrs. Cole," Caleb said with icy politeness. "What an unexpected pleasure." Margaret Cole was a woman in her early 60s, beautifully preserved and impeccably dressed, with silver hair arranged in an elaborate style that probably required daily professional attention. Her eyes were pale blue and calculating, taking in everything about Caleb and his house with the kind of assessment that reduced people to their monetary value. "Mr. Hartman," she replied with a smile that never reached those cold eyes. "I believe you have something that belongs to my family." "I'm afraid I don't know what you're referring to." "Of course you don't." Her tone suggested that she found his denial both expected and amusing. "Perhaps you'd be willing to discuss the matter inside. I've brought some associates who are very interested in our conversation." Behind her, Evelyn could see 4 men who didn't look like lawyers or business associates. They looked like the kind of men who solved problems through methods that didn't involve courtrooms or negotiations. "There's nothing to discuss," Caleb said firmly. "I've told your people before." "Mr. Hartman." Margaret's voice cut through his words like a blade. "I'm going to be very clear about something. My son was left at the altar by a woman who has since disappeared without a trace. This has caused considerable embarrassment to my family and substantial financial losses due to canceled arrangements. I want that woman found and returned to face her responsibilities. And I want a lot of things that aren't going to happen," Caleb replied. "Life's full of disappointments." "Indeed it is." Margaret's smile became sharper. "For instance, I've recently learned some very interesting things about your business dealings, Mr. Hartman. It seems that your ranch's water rights may not be quite as secure as you believed. There are questions about the original surveys, concerns about environmental impact suggestions that certain permits may have been obtained through irregular means. Caleb's expression didn't change, but Evelyn could see the tension in his shoulders. Whatever Margaret Cole was suggesting, it was serious enough to get his attention. What's your point, Mrs. Cole? My point is that wealthy men with complicated business arrangements often find themselves vulnerable to people with resources and determination. I have both in abundance, Mr. Hartman. I also have a very long memory when it comes to people who interfere with my family's interests. The threat was delivered with the casual tone of someone ordering lunch, but its implications hung heavy in the air between them. Evelyn felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn weather. This was what real power looked like, not Nathan's petulant cowardice, but his mother's cold calculation and willingness to destroy anyone who stood in her way. That sounds very much like extortion, Mrs. Cole, Caleb said quietly. It sounds like a business proposition. You return what belongs to my family, and I forget about the interesting questions that have arisen regarding your ranch. Everyone goes back to their normal lives, and nobody has to suffer any unpleasant consequences. For a moment, silence stretched between them like a drawn bowstring. Evelyn could feel the weight of the decision hanging in the air, the choice that would determine not just her future, but Caleb's as well. She thought about the past 3 weeks, the peace she'd found in the simple rhythms of ranch life, the growing connection between her and the man who'd offered her shelter when she had nowhere else to turn. She thought about Sarah Mitchell dead at 24 because other people's ambitions had mattered more than her life. She thought about the woman Caleb had been trying to save when he'd brought her to his ranch, and the man he'd been trying to redeem through his act of kindness. Most of all, she thought about the choice Margaret Cole was offering, the easy way out that would save everyone trouble and maintain the status quo that kept people like the Coles in control and people like her family firmly under their thumb. No, she said quietly, stepping into view from where she'd been standing behind Caleb. The answer is no. Margaret Cole's eyes shifted to her with the cold focus of a predator, finally spotting its prey. Miss Moore, how lovely to see you again. I trust you've enjoyed your little vacation from responsibility. I've enjoyed learning the difference between responsibility and servitude. Evelyn replied, moving to stand beside Caleb. Something I should have figured out years ago. How enlightened of you. Margaret's tone dripped with condescension. I'm sure Mr. Hartman has filled your head with all sorts of romantic notions about independence and self-determination. But we both know that you're going to come home eventually. The only question is whether you do so willingly or whether we have to make the alternatives less pleasant for everyone concerned. I am home, Evelyn said simply. This is where I choose to be. Choice. Margaret repeated the word as if it tasted bitter. You seem to have forgotten that choices have consequences, my dear. Your family's debts haven't disappeared just because you ran away from your obligations. Your father's business is still failing. Your sister still needs a secure future, and none of that changes because you've decided to play house with a rancher who's apparently forgotten his place in the natural order of things. The words hit their target with surgical precision. Evelyn felt the familiar weight of guilt settling on her shoulders, the responsibility that had driven every major decision of her adult life. Her family was still in trouble, still vulnerable to the kind of financial destruction that could leave them with nothing. But something had changed in the past 3 weeks. She'd learned that she was capable of more than she'd ever believed, that her worth wasn't measured solely by her ability to solve other people's problems. She'd found something here that she'd never known she was missing. Not just love, though that was growing stronger every day, but respect. Respect for her intelligence, her competence, her right to make decisions about her own life. You're right, she said quietly. Choices do have consequences. The choice to marry your son would have had consequences for me, for him, and ultimately for you. Because I would have made his life miserable, Mrs. Cole. I would have been a constant reminder that he was too weak to stand up to his mother, too cowardly to face the truth about what kind of man he really was. Margaret's composure slipped slightly, a flash of genuine anger breaking through her calculated charm. You ungrateful little... What I am, Evelyn interrupted, is done. Done with being traded like livestock to solve other people's problems. Done with pretending that duty means sacrificing my life for someone else's convenience. and done with being afraid of people who think money gives them the right to treat others as property. Noble words, Margaret said, recovering her poise. But nobility doesn't pay debts or keep families from losing everything they've worked for. Your father is going to lose his business, Miss Moore. Your sister will have no dowry, no prospects, no future beyond whatever charity her friends might be willing to provide. Is your newfound independence worth their suffering? The question hit like a physical blow, and Evelyn felt her resolve waver. This was the choice she'd been avoiding for weeks, the decision between her own happiness and her family's welfare. Margaret Cole knew exactly where her weaknesses lay and was pressing every advantage with the skill of someone who'd spent a lifetime manipulating people through their sense of obligation. Leave, Caleb said suddenly, his voice cutting through the emotional manipulation with the force of absolute authority. Get off my land now before I call the sheriff and have you arrested for trespassing. I don't think you want to involve the sheriff, Mr. Hartman, Margaret replied smoothly. Not given some of the irregularities in your business dealings that might come to light during any official investigation. Try me. Caleb stepped forward, and for the first time, Margaret Cole looked genuinely uncertain. There was something in his posture, in the set of his shoulders, and the expression in his eyes that suggested he was beyond caring about consequences to himself. I've been living with guilt over what happened to Sarah Mitchell for 15 years. You want to destroy me? Go ahead and try. But you won't get Evelyn, and you won't use her family as leverage to force her into a marriage that benefits nobody but your son's image. Sarah Mitchell. Margaret's eyes narrowed. The Mitchell girl who died after her family lost their ranch. What does she have to do with any of this? Everything, Caleb said quietly. She died because people like you convinced her that her value was measured by how much she could sacrifice for others. I won't let that happen again. Understanding dawned in Margaret's eyes, followed by something that might have been genuine surprise. You think you're saving her? How touching. But you can't save everyone, Mr. Hartman, and your romantic gestures won't change the mathematics of debt and obligation. Maybe not, Caleb agreed, but they might change what matters. For a long moment, Margaret Cole studied the two people standing before her, the rancher who'd made his choice and the woman who was still making hers. When she spoke again, her voice carried the kind of finality that suggested all pretense of negotiation was over. Very well, she said softly. You've both made your positions clear. I want you to remember this conversation in the months to come when the consequences of your choices become apparent. Mr. Hartman, you'll find that my reach extends further than you might imagine. Miss Moore, your family will suffer for your selfishness, and their suffering will be on your conscience forever. She turned to leave, then paused and looked back over her shoulder. Oh, and Miss Moore, Nathan asked me to give you a message. He says to tell you that he's already forgotten you ever existed. He's engaged to someone else now, someone with better breeding and fewer complications. The wedding is next month. The words were designed to hurt, to make her feel discarded and worthless. Instead, Evelyn felt something that surprised her: relief. Relief that Nathan had found someone else to disappoint. Relief that she was no longer responsible for his happiness or his family's schemes. I'm glad, she said simply. I hope they'll be very happy together. Margaret's mouth tightened at this unexpected response. Without another word, she stalked back to her car, her associates falling in behind her like well-trained dogs. Within minutes, the convoy was pulling away from the house, leaving dust and the promise of future trouble in their wake. Caleb and Evelyn stood on the porch watching until the last car disappeared over the horizon. Only then did Evelyn allow herself to acknowledge the magnitude of what had just happened. She'd burned her bridges, cut herself off from the world she'd known, chosen love and independence over security and duty. Are you all right? Caleb asked gently. I don't know, she admitted. Ask me again in a few months after we see what kind of damage she can actually do. We'll face whatever comes, he said simply. Together. She turned to look at him, this man who'd offered her shelter and found himself threatened with destruction for his kindness. You could still change your mind, she said quietly. Tell me to go before this gets any worse. I'd understand. Would you? Caleb moved closer, close enough that she could see the silver flecks in his dark eyes and the lines that spoke of years spent in sun and wind. Because I'm not sure I would understand. I've spent 15 years trying to make amends for one failure of courage. I'm not about to commit another one. And if Margaret Cole makes good on her threats, if you lose everything because of me, then I'll build it back, he said with absolute certainty. I did it once before and I can do it again. But I can't build back what I'll lose if I let you walk away now. The words hung between them, heavy with implication and possibility. For weeks they'd been dancing around the growing attraction between them, the connection that went beyond simple gratitude or convenience. Now with their future uncertain and their enemies declared, the careful distance they'd maintained seemed not just unnecessary but impossible. Caleb, she whispered, and he could hear everything she couldn't say in the way she spoke his name. I know, he said gently. I know this complicates everything. I know you're still figuring out what you want from life, and I know I'm probably the last thing you need right now. But Evelyn, but, but I'm 47 years old and I've been alone for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to want someone to stay. And then you came along and suddenly I can't imagine my house without coffee for 2 in the morning, or dinner conversations that stretch past sunset, or the sound of someone else moving through my days. She reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jewel with infinite gentleness. I never knew, she said softly, that being chosen could feel so different from being needed. What's the difference? When someone needs you, you're solving their problem. When someone chooses you, you're becoming part of their life. She smiled, and for the first time since he'd known her, it reached her eyes completely. I choose you too, Caleb Hartman, whatever comes next. He leaned down and kissed her. Then a kiss that was gentle and fierce and full of promise. It tasted like coffee and courage, like morning rain and the endless possibilities of an uncertain future. When they broke apart, both were breathing unsteadily, both aware that they'd crossed a line from which there would be no retreat. So what happens now? Evelyn asked. Caleb looked out over his land at the cattle grazing in distant pastures and the mountains standing sentinel against the endless sky. Somewhere out there, Margaret Cole was planning her next move, gathering resources and allies for whatever campaign she intended to wage against them. There would be legal challenges, financial pressures, social ostracism, and probably worse. But there would also be mornings like this one with Evelyn beside him, and the future spreading out before them like an unwritten story. There would be conversations over dinner, shared work, and shared dreams, the simple miracle of two people choosing to face whatever came together rather than apart. Now, he said, pulling her closer, we find out what we're made of. 6 months later, Evelyn stood in the same kitchen where she'd eaten her first meal at the Hartman Ranch, watching through the window as Caleb worked with a young horse in the corral. The legal battles with the Cole family were ongoing, expensive, and exhausting, but not the catastrophe Margaret had promised. Caleb's business dealings had proven more solid than his enemies had hoped, and his reputation in the community stronger than they'd calculated. Her family's situation had indeed worsened after her refusal to marry Nathan, but not as dramatically as Margaret had threatened. Her father's business had failed, but he'd found work managing another man's investments, and her sister had surprised everyone by announcing her intention to attend college rather than marry immediately. You taught me something, her sister had written in a recent letter. You taught me that I don't have to solve everyone else's problems by sacrificing my own life. It's a lesson I intend to remember. The knock at the front door interrupted her thoughts. She wasn't expecting anyone, and unexpected visitors still made her nervous, given their history with the Cole family. But when she opened the door, she found a young man she didn't recognize, probably in his early 20s, with the kind of nervous energy that suggested important news. Miss Moore, Miss Evelyn Moore? Yes, I'm Thomas Wright from Wright and Associates. We're attorneys in Helena. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, clutching a leather portfolio. I have some news regarding the estate of your great-aunt, Millicent Ashford. Evelyn stared at him blankly. I'm sorry, I think there's been some mistake. I don't have a great-aunt named Millicent. According to our records, she was your grandfather's sister. She emigrated to Canada in 1952 and made quite a fortune in timber and real estate. She died last month, and apparently she'd been following your family's situation for some time. Thomas opened his portfolio and extracted a thick document. She's left you a substantial inheritance, Miss Moore, substantial enough to solve most of your family's financial difficulties and provide for your own future as well. The irony was almost too perfect to be believed. Just when she'd finally learned to live without the security of money to find her worth in something other than her ability to solve other people's problems, financial salvation had arrived from a source she'd never even known existed. How substantial? She asked weakly. Approximately $2 million after taxes and legal fees. Evelyn sank into the nearest chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of this unexpected windfall. $2 million would save her father's retirement fund, her sister's education, and provide her with independence that had nothing to do with marriage or sacrifice. It would also change everything between her and Caleb. She'd chosen him when she had nothing to offer but herself. Now she would have to choose him again, knowing that she was financially independent, that she could go anywhere and do anything she wanted. The sound of boots on the porch announced Caleb's return from the corral. He entered the kitchen, dusty and tired, stopping short when he saw Evelyn's expression and the young lawyer standing uncertainly by the door. "What's wrong?" he asked immediately. "Nothing's wrong," Evelyn said, rising from her chair with a smile that was equal parts joy and trepidation. "Everything's about to change again." As she explained about the inheritance, Caleb's expression remained carefully neutral, but she could see the thoughts racing behind his eyes. This changed everything and nothing. It gave her options she'd never had before, but it didn't change the choice they'd made to face the future together. "Congratulations," he said quietly after Thomas Wright had departed with promises to handle all the legal details. "Your family will be secure now." "Yes," she agreed, "they will be. And you'll have your independence. You can go anywhere, do anything you want." "Yes," she said again, moving closer to him. "I can." He waited, not asking the question that hung between them, but allowing her the space to answer it in her own time. "Do you know what I want to do with my newfound independence?" she asked. "What?" "I want to marry a rancher," she said simply. "A stubborn, honorable man who rescued me when I was lost and taught me the difference between being needed and being chosen. I want to spend my mornings watching him work with horses and my evenings planning the life we're going to build together." Caleb's careful control finally cracked, and she could see the relief and love and desperate hope in his eyes. "Even though you don't have to anymore, even though you have other choices now." "Especially because I don't have to," she said, reaching up to frame his face with her hands. "I told you once that being chosen felt different from being needed. This is what choice looks like, Caleb. This is what it means to build a life instead of settling for one." He kissed her then, long and deep and full of promise, while outside the Montana sky stretched endlessly above their land. Somewhere in the distance, cattle grazed in pastures that would soon belong to both of them, and horses ran free in paddocks where their children might someday learn to ride. The past had taken its toll on both of them, marked them with scars that would never completely fade. But the future spread before them like an unwritten story full of possibility and choice, and the simple miracle of two people who'd found each other when they'd both stopped looking for love. It wasn't the ending either of them had planned, but it was the one they'd chosen. And in a world where too many people settled for what was expected rather than reaching for what was possible, that choice made all the difference. Thank you so much for joining us on Caleb and Evelyn's journey from loneliness to love, from duty to choice. If this story of second chances and finding strength in unexpected places touched your heart, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming Western romance tales. What did you think of Evelyn's transformation from dutiful daughter to independent woman? And how about Caleb's journey from guilt-ridden isolation to opening his heart again? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We love hearing from you. Don't forget to hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest stories of love, redemption, and the healing power of making your own choices. Until next time, remember that it's never too late to choose the life you truly want to live.